Have you ever felt like you had something important to say, but were terrified of the consequences? Today, we're talking about someone who faced that fear head-on. This is the story of Miguel Alvarez, a journalist who dared to break a deafening silence. Miguel wasn't your typical hard-hitting investigative reporter chasing scandals or political intrigue. He was a features writer, known for his warm, human interest stories. But deep down, a different story was brewing. One that was intensely personal and universally ignored: male sexual abuse. For years, Miguel had listened to the whispers, the quiet confessions from friends, the heartbreaking accounts he stumbled upon online. He saw a hidden epidemic of pain, shrouded in shame and disbelief. Society had built this invisible wall around the topic, a fortress of toxic masculinity that told men to man up, to be strong, to never be a victim. And Miguel knew this wall was crushing people. He decided he couldn't stay silent any longer. He pitched the story to his editor. The reaction was lukewarm. Is there really an audience for this, Miguel? It's a bit heavy. But Miguel persisted, his passion undeniable. He argued it wasn't just a story. It was a lifeline for countless men suffering in isolation. Reluctantly, his editor agreed, giving him a small column space. The day the article was published, a nervous energy filled Miguel's world. He expected a few supportive emails, maybe some quiet appreciation. What he got was a firestorm. The comments section exploded. "This is ridiculous," one wrote. "Men can't be victims in that way." Another said, "He's just trying to get attention by making things up." The backlash was swift and brutal. He was accused of being weak, of trying to undermine masculinity, of manufacturing a problem that didn't exist. The negativity wasn't just online. Colleagues at work started avoiding him in the hallways. Old friends grew distant. The very people he thought would understand were the ones turning their backs. The isolation was suffocating. Miguel started to doubt himself. Was he wrong? Was he just projecting his own insecurities? The weight of the world felt like it was on his shoulders, and he was crumbling. He hit a low point, staring at his reflection, seeing the tired, defeated man looking back. He had tried to help, but all he had done was make himself a target. The shame he was trying to fight for others had now latched onto him. He felt like a failure, but then something shifted. Amidst the torrent of hate, a single email arrived. It was from a man named David. "I read your article," it began. "For 20 years, I thought I was the only one. I thought I was broken. Your words, they made me feel seen. For the first time, I don't feel alone." That one email was a spark in the darkness. Then another came, and another. Men from all walks of life, from different cities, different countries, started reaching out. They shared their own harrowing stories, their decades of silence, their struggles with depression and anxiety. They weren't just emails. They were confessions, cries for help, and messages of profound gratitude. Miguel realized he hadn't been screaming into the void. He had been a voice for the voiceless. He had ignited a conversation that was desperately needed, no matter how uncomfortable it was. The hate was loud, but the support, though quieter, was infinitely more powerful. This newfound purpose reignited his spirit. He wasn't just a journalist anymore. He was an advocate. He started a blog, a safe space for men to share their experiences anonymously. He began hosting online support groups, connecting survivors with each other and with mental health professionals. He used his platform not to fight the haters, but to amplify the voices of the survivors. The journey was far from easy. The backlash never completely disappeared, but Miguel was no longer alone. He was part of a growing community, a brotherhood of survivors and allies determined to tear down that wall of silence, brick by brick. He learned that true strength isn't about never being a victim. It's about having the courage to speak your truth, to be vulnerable, and to help others find their own voice. Miguel Alvarez's story teaches us that one person's courage can create a ripple effect, turning a whisper into a roar. It reminds us that conversations about mental health and trauma are vital for everyone, regardless of gender. If you or someone you know is struggling, please know that help is available and you are not alone. Reaching out is a sign of incredible strength. Thank you so much for watching. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more content that matters. We'll see you in the next one. As Miguel Alvarez stepped deeper into the storm he had created, the weight of his decision became heavier with each passing day. The more he spoke, the more resistance he faced. Yet the more stories came forward. These stories no longer came as anonymous messages alone. They came with faces, trembling voices, and eyes filled with years of suppressed pain. Men who had never imagined that a journalist would take them seriously now sat across from Miguel in quiet rooms, telling stories that had been buried under shame for decades. One man spoke about being a teenage intern assaulted by a senior female supervisor who told him that if he spoke up, he would never work again. Another described being intoxicated at a party and waking up to an act he never consented to, only to be mocked by friends when he tried to explain his trauma. Miguel listened without interruption, knowing that for many of them, this was the first time their truth was being acknowledged. Every story strengthened his resolve, even as the backlash intensified. Social media platforms became battlegrounds where clips of his broadcasts were taken out of context. Headlines accused him of promoting misogyny, despite his repeated statements that justice for men did not take justice away from women. Politicians avoided him. Invitations to official events stopped coming, and whispers began circulating in media circles that Miguel was becoming a liability to the industry. His station managers pressured him harder than ever, warning him that ratings were dropping, sponsors were threatening lawsuits, and government regulators were suddenly paying unusual attention to his program. But Miguel understood that this was how uncomfortable truths were treated. They were not debated honestly. They were silenced quietly behind closed doors. Yet he continued pushing forward, arranging interviews with psychologists who explained how male victims experience trauma differently because society denies them emotional expression, legal experts who admitted that existing laws were inadequate to protect men, and counselors who revealed alarming statistics about depression, suicide, and substance abuse among male survivors of sexual abuse. Miguel made sure his language remained careful, compassionate, and factual, because he knew one mistake could be used to discredit the entire movement. Despite his efforts, the pressure eventually reached a breaking point. One morning, Miguel was called into the boardroom, where executives sat with expressions devoid of empathy. They thanked him for his years of service, then informed him that his program was being indefinitely suspended due to restructuring concerns and brand alignment issues. Miguel understood the message immediately. This was punishment, disguised as policy. As he walked out of the building for the last time, staff members avoided eye contact, some out of fear, others out of guilt. A few quietly shook his hand, whispering words of support, but none dared speak publicly because they too had careers to protect. The following weeks were some of the hardest of Miguel's life. Without the daily routine of broadcasting, he found himself alone with his thoughts and memories that grew louder without the distraction of work. It was during this period of forced silence that Miguel finally confronted his own past fully, something he had avoided even while advocating for others. When he was 17, he had been a scholarship student, dependent on the goodwill of adults in authority. And one of those adults, a woman admired, respected, and trusted, had crossed boundaries under the guise of mentorship. It began with inappropriate comments, then escalated into physical contact that left Miguel confused, frozen, and terrified. When it finally crossed into outright assault, Miguel did not scream or fight back. Not because he wanted it, but because shock had paralyzed him. Afterward, he told a friend who laughed and said, "You're a lucky man." He considered telling a teacher, but imagined the ridicule and disbelief, so he did what society taught him to do. He buried it deep, convinced himself it didn't matter, and moved on. Outwardly successful, inwardly fractured. It took years before he understood how that experience shaped his difficulty with intimacy, his unexplained anger, and his relentless drive to prove his masculinity through achievement. Now, years later, stripped of his platform, Miguel questioned whether it had all been worth it. But then the messages began to arrive. Men thanking him for speaking up. Men saying they had finally sought therapy because of his broadcasts. Fathers saying they had learned to listen to their sons differently. And even women expressing gratitude for broadening the conversation around consent and abuse. Miguel realized that although he had lost his job, his voice had not been erased. It had simply moved beyond traditional media. He began speaking at universities, community halls, and small conferences, often without pay, sometimes traveling long distances, just to reach a handful of listeners. But every conversation mattered, because change rarely begins in large halls. It starts in quiet rooms with honest dialogue. However, the struggle was far from over. Opposition groups organized petitions, accusing him of spreading dangerous narratives. Trolls harassed him online, digging into his personal life, trying to intimidate him into silence. And there were nights when exhaustion made him question his own strength. Yet each time doubt crept in, Miguel remembered the faces of the men who had trusted him with their stories. And he knew he could not abandon them, because abandonment was what society had already done to them. In one particularly tense forum, Miguel was confronted publicly by a critic who accused him of diverting attention from women's suffering. And Miguel responded calmly, saying that acknowledging one injustice does not erase another, and that empathy is not a limited resource. His response was met with mixed reactions, but for the first time, some critics paused to listen rather than shout. As months passed, Miguel began collaborating with international advocates who were pushing for gender-inclusive approaches to sexual violence, prevention, and survivor support. Through these connections, he learned that the problem was global, not cultural. Male victims existed everywhere, silenced by the same myths and expectations. And this realization reinforced his belief that his fight was part of something larger than himself. Yet, despite growing recognition, mainstream media continued to exclude him. Invitations to speak on television were rare, and when they came, they were framed as debates rather than discussions, forcing Miguel to constantly defend the legitimacy of male suffering instead of focusing on solutions. Still, he persisted, because he knew that progress often looks like resistance before it looks like acceptance. And one evening, while preparing notes for a small talk, Miguel received a message from a young man who wrote, "Because of you, I told my parents what happened to me, and they believed me." Miguel stared at the screen for a long time, tears forming in his eyes, because in that moment, every loss, every insult, every closed door felt insignificant compared to the fact that one more voice had been freed from silence. And as Miguel prepared to step onto a modest stage to speak once again, he understood that his journey was far from over, that the hardest part still lay ahead, because eventually he would have to tell the world the full truth, not just about others, but about himself. And the reason he had been willing to lose everything for a conversation society refused to have was because silence had once almost destroyed him, and he would not allow it to destroy anyone else. As Miguel Alvarez stood at the final stage of a journey he never planned to begin, he understood that his story had grown beyond journalism and transformed into something far more dangerous and far more necessary, because once society is forced to look at what it has ignored, it reacts not with acceptance, but with fear, and Miguel had become a mirror reflecting an uncomfortable truth back at the nation. Yet even as resistance continued, something subtle had begun to change. Conversations that were once dismissed now lingered longer. People who once laughed now hesitated before mocking. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the silence began to crack. Miguel's public appearances grew larger, not because institutions invited him back, but because people demanded to hear him. Community groups organized events without sponsors. Universities opened forums led by students, not administrators. And online platforms carried his speeches far beyond the reach he once had through traditional broadcasting. He spoke not with anger, but with clarity, emphasizing again and again that recognizing male victims did not weaken women's rights, but strengthened the integrity of justice itself. He explained that abuse is about power, not gender, and that any system that protects only some victims while ignoring others is fundamentally broken. As these ideas spread, Miguel found himself contacted by lawmakers who once ignored him, now quietly asking questions behind closed doors about policy gaps and reporting structures. They did not yet support him publicly, but the seeds of change were being planted, and Miguel understood that progress often begins in whispers before it ever reaches legislation or whether. The most difficult moment of his journey arrived when Miguel decided to share his own story publicly, not as rumor, not as implication, but as truth. He knew the risks, the scrutiny, the doubt, and ridicule. But he also knew that advocacy without vulnerability can only go so far. During a nationally streamed independent forum, Miguel stood before a camera without notes, without a script, and without the armor he had worn for decades, and he spoke. He told them about being 17, about trust, about fear, about the moment his voice failed him, and the years he spent pretending it did not matter. He described the laughter, the dismissal, the internalized shame, and the long road to understanding that what happened to him was not weakness, but violation. The room was silent, not the tense silence of hostility, but the heavy silence of recognition. For the first time, many viewers saw a man speak about sexual abuse without apology, without bravado, and without denial. That moment rippled outward. Clips spread rapidly across social media. Reactions were polarized, as expected. Some accused him of fabrication, others weaponized his pain against him, but many more responded with empathy. Men shared their own stories, women expressed sorrow and support, and parents said they were rethinking how they spoke to their sons about vulnerability. Miguel received messages from survivors across the world, thanking him for putting words to experiences they had never been able to name. And while the backlash was intense, it no longer had the power to silence him because he had already given up everything that fear could take. His career, his status, his anonymity, all gone. What remained was purpose, and purpose proved stronger than reputation. In the months that followed, Miguel worked with advocacy groups to push for concrete change, improved reporting mechanisms, gender-neutral language in sexual assault laws, and training for law enforcement to handle male survivor cases with seriousness and respect. Progress was slow and often frustrating, but undeniable. Pilot programs were introduced, studies commissioned, and for the first time, official conversations included male victimization without mockery. Miguel knew that change would not come overnight, but he also knew that history is shaped by those willing to endure discomfort, to speak truth when it costs them everything. Toward the end of the year, Miguel was invited to speak at a small memorial event for survivors of all genders. Standing before a modest crowd, he reflected on his journey with humility, acknowledging the countless unheard voices that had come before him and the many who would continue the fight. He said that power does not lie in dominance, but in the courage to confront injustice, even when it benefits from silence. He reminded them that protecting women and acknowledging men are not opposing causes, but parallel paths toward a society that truly understands consent, dignity, and humanity. As he stepped away from the microphone, Miguel felt something he had not felt in years. Peace. Not because the fight was over, but because he had finally aligned his voice with his truth. He no longer needed approval from institutions that feared change because the people had spoken, and they were listening differently. Fathers were teaching sons that strength includes vulnerability. Mothers were teaching daughters that consent applies universally, and young men were learning that speaking up does not make them weak. It makes them human. Miguel's name may never be fully restored in mainstream media. History may not paint him as a hero, but that no longer mattered, because somewhere, a man who would have stayed silent now spoke. Somewhere, a boy who would have blamed himself now understood that abuse is never the victim's fault. And somewhere, a conversation once considered impossible was now unavoidable. In that realization, Miguel Alvarez understood the true power of journalism. Not the microphone, not the platform, but the willingness to stand alone, if necessary, in defense of truth. Because justice that excludes is not justice at all. And a society that listens only to some of its wounded will never fully heal. And so, even if his voice never returned to the airwaves, it would continue to echo in every space where silence once ruled, reminding the world of a simple, undeniable truth. Sexual abuse is a crime regardless of gender, and no victim deserves to be erased.